The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong.
Now that time of trouble is just ahead. That's going to follow the proclaiming of the true gospel that I'm doing tonight in your ears. You want to know about prophecy being fulfilled? You're hearing it right now. Nuclear world war leading to Armageddon and the end of this world definitely is prophesied, and for this present living generation.
There's certain things like dishonoring your mother and your father is an automatic curse. When you dishonor your father and mother, you don't have a sound mind.
Those of you that have not surrendered to God to really be obedient to Him, you don't agree very far with me, do you? Of course you don't. You can't. You're carnal-minded, and the carnal mind is enmity against God. The carnal mind is hostile toward God.
But I do see the demons when they're in someone, and they see me. I could talk about demons all day long right here. I can name demons by name. The devil has everybody out there. He already has them. He's not worried about them. He's concerned about you.
Welcome back to the Cult Next Door podcast. Several weeks ago, around episode 3, is where we kind of diverged from Ashley's story for a few episodes. Episode 4, we talked about the bite model, and then 5 through 8, we spoke to our sister Jen about kind of her recollection of her childhood, and then we had a couple episodes where we talked about a little bit some of my story. So now we're going to kind of jump back in to Ashley's story and the aftermath after she was removed from the family, essentially, and her kind of path, through the church and worldwide offshoots after that.
Before I continue the story of what happened in the aftermath of losing the family and being excommunicated, I feel like it's important to go back to a few key themes in my childhood as it relates to growing up in the Worldwide Church of God. These connector moments and events I'll tie into the post-excommunication timeline, so just bear with me. So when I think back on my childhood, there were really 2 overarching fears that dominated my thoughts, to the point that they were like so ingrained in such a part of me that looking back now, I'm stunned by how much they shaped me and just how much a part of me they became. They really instructed the way that I viewed the world, the way that I viewed myself, the way that I viewed other people. They were essentially woven into the fabric of who I was, so much so that I never even considered them to be anything other than the truth. Small children, just thinking about how early Dad found the Worldwide Church of God. I was so young. I think we've talked about this. I think I was 3 or 4 years old. Thinking about me as a really small child and knowing that small children believe what they're told pretty much without question, that's how they learn about the world around them. And I think Jen mentioned that in one of the last episodes that, if she told her daughter there were purple pigs out in the sky, her daughter would run out to look. That's just the nature of small children. And, the brain of a child is like a sponge, and children are soaking up huge amounts of information, and they're making connections in the brain that inform the way they think and the way that they move about in the world. And people have probably heard of her, but Maria Montessori, she's probably heard of Montessori schools. She pioneered that, and she was an educator, and she wrote a book about children called The Absorbent Mind. There's a quote from that book that I feel like really illustrates kind of the way that a child intakes information. And it goes, "The things he sees are not just remembered, they form part of his soul. He incarnates in himself all in the world about him that his eyes see and his ears hear." And that's pretty profound to think about. And also knowing that I think it's in the neighborhood of 85% of a child's core brain structure is developed in the first 5 years. That core foundation that is built through what you're told and what you're taught and what you see modeled for you is what is built upon for the rest of your life. And so when you're a child and you're told the stove is hot, don't touch it. If you didn't believe it when they first told you that, as soon as you ventured to find out, is it hot? You found out real quick. It's hot. I'm not going to touch that. It's the same with so many things in a child's life. And it's no different with religious beliefs, is what I'm getting at. So small children don't have critical thinking skills available to them at all. So when a child is told that the stove is hot, and then by touching it, it's confirmed and reinforced that it is indeed hot, they will, of course, believe that, and they'll believe other things that are given the same level of credence and truth by their caretakers. So when I think about our childhoods, I think about all of those things that we were taught that really were just woven into the fabric of who we are. And coming to realizations later in life, in adulthood, about the experiences we had is very difficult, because first comes the knowledge that, okay, these things happen. But then secondary to that is, how do you root out these things when it's such a part of who you are and how you viewed yourself and how you viewed other people and your position in the world?
And your thought processes. I was actually listening to a podcast today. I think you know Rhett and Link.
Yeah.
Those guys. I was listening to a podcast, and it was Link. This is one, I think, from February. Every year, they'll kind of do a new episode where they talk about, I think it was the 3-year mark of Link's deconstruction. So he's kind of talking about exactly what you're saying. Like it's interesting. It's kind of a paradoxical kind of thing, because you're thinking about what you don't believe anymore. And in our case, like, the beliefs from worldwide and the way that we were raised that we don't agree with, but our thought processes were set by that time. It's kind of an interesting thing. Like, the way you view it was set during that early 5-year period. So it's almost like it's a weird thing to think about. It's like a circular logic type thing almost, to where it's you're understanding that even the way that you can process it now is so heavily informed by it, which is so interesting. Like, it's inescapable in a way.
Yes.
Not to make it sound too gloomy, but it is that, it's hard to really take a 30,000 foot view of anything, because it's just your whole thought process is from this period of time, and there's nothing you can do to change that in a moment.
Right. And I think the first step is learning to recognize those patterns or those thoughts, the narratives that might pop into our heads about things, and recognizing that that is there. Then from that point, we can start to challenge those thoughts. But it is really frustrating when you don't actually believe that, but those things still pop up for you. It's really frustrating. So I feel that. So in the days of the Worldwide Church of God, the dominant rhetoric that I heard day in and day out through incredibly long church services. I mean, at that time, I think Worldwide really settled into a 2-hour church service, with a sermon being an hour to an hour and a half. But I remember in Worldwide days that there were certain ministers who would go multiple hours in speaking, and you were supposed to just endure that because they were being inspired by God. And so you just kind of never knew what you were walking into. If someone felt the Spirit or whatever it was, they could give a 3-hour sermon. And I know that you know exactly what I'm talking about here. We had our daily monologues and Bible studies from Dad. I mean, was it not your experience also that this was a constant topic of conversation, like biblical things, spiritual things?
Yes, I mean, it was even talked about people who didn't want to talk about that all the time as if they were somehow lesser or worldly. Like this was the high plane of thought that you should be on.
Yeah.
Is talking about things of God, not football.
Right.
Not that you couldn't, but like, no, if you really want to do it upright, like you need to be thinking about this all the time. So
The
yeah,
things
that
of
was
God.
dominant for sure.
Yeah. Ugh. And I know, he would have family Bible studies often. So it wasn't just that he was talking to us because he worked from home and he had a shop outside, but he would oftentimes have us come out there. And I can't count how many times I would sit on the floor and he would be painting, or lettering a sign or something. And he's talking to me about spiritual things. He's talking about me about the church and about what I'm about to get into here in a minute. We also had in the Worldwide Church of God the telecast. So that I think was weekly, and we did watch that as a family. And then, of course, there were lots of reading materials from the church. And I would like to point out that I think I read this in Stephen Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, or either in the book or on his website, that a very common cult tactic is to provide literature for the congregation that is almost in place of the Bible. So, yes, you have the Bible and you're going to be turning to scriptures during a service, but the interpretation of all of these scriptures are just in this neat little tidy booklet or book in some cases that you can read at home. And so I feel like there was a really heavy emphasis on the material, the written material from the church as, real valuable for us as far as understanding scripture. All of that, the monologues, the Bible studies, the telecast, the church services, and reading materials, so much of that was dominated by talk about the Great Tribulation and how it was just imminent. The church described the Great Tribulation as a time of great suffering. I remember the scripture. I've got it written down here, but I can probably say it word for word just because I have heard it so many times. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved alive. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And we were the elect. Do you remember? I mean, I feel like I heard that scripture a million times over my childhood. I don't know how much Dad emphasized the Great Tribulation, but it was an overarching theme in my childhood.
He did talk about the tribulation often, but I feel like there was a little bit of a shift in focus, which is probably, having to do with what we view as his particular malady of grandiosity.
Yeah.
Where it was the focus was more in terms of the end time, that it was less about here's how terrible it's going to be, but here's how we are specifically chosen for this time. We're special for this time, which Liz and I talked about this even this week, which it's such a difficult thing even now for me to marry these two ideas together. But you had on one hand, and I think Sandy talked about this too, you had on one hand, we're special, we are the latter rain, like we are it. Like this small group of people in particular, like you guys are the ones. And then on the other hand, the left hand over here, you guys are shit.
Yeah.
You're shit bags. Excuse my language, but that's what it was like. It was like you are only redeemed by the grace of God because you don't have anything of yourself that's worth anything. You are worth nothing. You are soiled rags. And then on the other hand, you had you're special and you have this special spiritual lineage and all of these things that came down through these revelations and prophecies, during our time in Crusade Church near the end. But it's so difficult even now to be like, how did those two exist? But I think that was probably what kept people in limbo so much.
Yeah, those dichotomies.
I'm not worth anything. Like, it's only by the grace of God that I'm even, alive. I should be dead and trampled underfoot.
Oh,
and then on the other
absolutely.
And on the other hand, it's like, no, I'm God's most special boy. It's so weird how we had that, like, we're not worth anything, but I certainly had it. And I know other people in the church did too. Like, there's a sense of pride. You thought you knew something that other people didn't. You were special in a way that even Christians weren't. There were people I worked with for years that were Christians, but I looked at them as if I were somehow above them, even though I also had the alternate view of I'm just a complete screw up and not worth anything. It's such a weird, I don't even know how to describe what that is, but it's very strange to even think about and more difficult to describe what that is. But
yeah, it's completely confusing. So the Great Tribulation was to last 3.5 years, and then that would be followed by a time of God's great wrath. Herbert Armstrong claimed that God was using him during this end time to interpret biblical prophecy and reveal the truth. He was, considered to be the end time Elijah who was sent by God to restore all things to God's true church before the second coming of Christ. So before I was even born and before Dad came into the church, Armstrong had told everyone that this was all going to happen in 1972. It would be Christ was coming back, the start of the Great Tribulation. And obviously that did not happen. And I do not know this for sure. I think he set another date after that. It seems to me that I recall he set 2 or 3 dates. At some point, though, he stopped setting actual dates on the calendar, and then he would instead speak about how close it was. So he would say things like, it may only be a year from now, or in this decade, in this, this generation won't pass before this happens. And he used to say that it would be in his lifetime. And when I was hearing this, he was already an old man. So for me, as a young child, like this was about to happen, like any day. And I remember hearing sermons like when I was small about how many of us would not even get to grow up to have families, and the world would end before we could get married, have children.
Oh, I not to interrupt, but
Yeah.
like that in particular, I absolutely thought that when I was a kid.
Yeah. Okay.
That
so
I would
Dad
not-
did
That I
hone
would
in on
not
that.
live to old age.
Yeah.
Like the tribulation, that's how, for context for people,
Yeah.
that's how around the corner we thought, like I thought, like I'm not gonna be a 65-year-old man. There's no way.
And piggybacking on to that, I believed that too. So even after I reached adulthood, and obviously, okay, the tribulation didn't come, I got married, still didn't come, I had children. Even still, I still thought this is going to happen in my lifetime. And the belief system in the church was that if you were baptized, what that meant was that when Jesus came back after the tribulation, that all of the first fruits would be raised from the dead, those that had died before. Those were the saints that were God's people. These were people like Noah and Moses and Aaron and King David. And these people would be raised from the dead out of their graves, and they would meet Jesus in the sky as spirit beings. And those of us who were still alive but did have God's Holy Spirit, we would be changed to spirit beings in an instant, and we would also go up with these saints to meet Jesus in the sky. What that means is that you don't ever experience death, which is, just think about that for a second. Like literally being in your 30s and thinking, unless a tragic accident happens or I just get like terminally ill, I'm not going to die. I don't have to think about death. Everybody else has to think about it, but not me.
Or preparing for anything in later life.
No, you don't need to worry about retirement. Don't pursue a career. Don't go to college. It's a waste of money and time because, that you're never going to see those things through.
Which is why it was a surprise at the time when, Dad pushed for Jen and Sarah to go to college. Because it was almost like, why? Like, the end time is literally around the corner.
Yeah. And this is a side note, but I believed this into my 30s. It has been a really interesting thing for me to contemplate my own death suddenly, and there are times where it hits me out of nowhere, and it's just such a strange thing. I'm like, I'm going to die. Like someday I will die. What a strange concept. So it was also taught, that, many of us, aside from not being able to have children or families or pursue careers, which I will say with the pursuing careers, that really mostly applied to the men, because in the church, a woman's role was simply to have children and to be her husband's helpmeet. There was really nothing beyond that. Although, like, I know there were women who went to college, especially Ambassador College, because it was the church college, but I don't think that, they were really probably going there to pursue careers. I know there were a lot of marriages that happened, took place from being at Ambassador College, and there, were a lot of Bible classes and such. But anyway, it was also taught, so much, like I heard this so many times, woe to them who are with child. You're shaking your head, which means you've heard that a lot too. Like, you do not want to be pregnant or with small children when the Great Tribulation comes. So if there's any possibility like that is about to happen, you have to really contemplate whether you're going to start a family or not. And I remember when Kurt and I married, we talked about that. Do we start a family? I mean, can you imagine? This is 25 years ago. I know that during that time, there were many people who chose not to have children. And there were many people who, just like you said, did not prepare for retirement or or really any kind of future. The caveat, though, to all of this doom and destruction coming that would, that was said that would annihilate most of the people on the earth, was that we, the elect of God, would be spared and taken to a place of safety. And if we would just realize our own wickedness and submit to God's will, which, in the church, the interpretation was submitting to Herbert Armstrong's will and his interpretation of scriptures. But if we submitted, then we might be spared. And so I remember, it's super triggering sometimes for me to hear even our intro where Herbert Armstrong is yelling from the pulpit. I forgot how much a part of my childhood that was. Hearing that man scream at people. I mean, I'm sure that he didn't scream for the entire hour and a half, but as a child, that was just part of, my core memories was, just hearing him yell, and it was scary and it was frightening, and he held a sort of authority, with his authoritarian presence and his charisma and fire and brimstone, and it felt very believable. And it really heightened the sense that, this is about to happen. Get ready. I remember him screaming these things from the pulpit that, catastrophe was coming. I remember that word being used a lot. And that catastrophe was primarily coming for the people of the United States. Right?
Imagine that.
Which came from his teaching that the United States and Britain were actually part of the lost tribes of Israel, and that, the Anglo-Saxons were God's chosen nation and were the direct descendants of King David.
Ephraim and Manasseh, baby.
Yes.
Come on. British Israelism. We might be spared the tribulation. There were going to be some Christians that were going to have to go through it.
Yes.
And others who wouldn't. But if you don't, that's because you're enduring now. So basically you're going to have to go through
suffering,
agony and suffering now or then. So it almost makes the misery that we in part lived with, it made it make sense where it's well, I guess better now than tribulation where I might be tortured. I remember Blake will talk about it, but
absolutely.
Blake was terrified of being tortured and if he would be able to withstand it. Blake is 17, 18, thinking his mind is tortured over this, and he's praying every night about, being counted worthy to, that type of thing where it's
Blake and I apparently had the same childhood experience with that. It is traumatizing. Yeah. They taught that there was spiritual force behind the laws of God, as Herbert Armstrong set out. And I remember him saying that if you break those laws, the laws will break you.
Ooh.
And that was a scary thing to consider. And it was just continually repeated that punishment was coming. I mean, I heard the word punishment so many times. And I think if you look up his writing, you'll see that. And the punishment was going to be extreme. Graphic imagery was frequently used to describe the punishment. I specifically remember the brutal imagery of people being taken captive and pulled through the streets with fish hooks in their mouths. You're shaking your head. Do you remember that as well?
Yeah, I think, was that from the book of Daniel? Or I'm trying to remember. There was it may have been a prophecy that
there's a reference somewhere.
It talked about that, and then that was applied as if that were not, a story about the Israelites in the past, but it was about the tribulation.
Yes.
And so, yes, that was hooks through the mouth and being pulled around, hooks through the nose and things like that. The babies' heads being bashed against the rocks. That was looking ahead to the end time.
Yeah. The fish hooks in the mouth, for some reason, just always really stood out to me. anytime I think about that, I immediately conjure the same image I have had since I was a little girl of people being dragged through the streets that way. And I remember hearing about how horrifying it would be, especially if you were a woman during this time. They talked about rape, and that, I don't know if you remember this. This is just incredibly graphic, but I remember them talking about, that women with children, like with who are pregnant, would have fetuses cut out of their wombs. You remember that? Like, just savage brutalness. And we were told, like you just mentioned with Blake, that there would be torture that we couldn't even imagine. Just atrocities that people would have to endure, such like the world has never seen. That was how they applied that scripture. And that imagery was the stuff of nightmares. I mean, it would be, I think that would be difficult for anyone to think about. But then when you think about learning about those things and being described those things as a very young child, what does a child do with that information? How do you even process that?
And back to what you talked about and Jen talked about, you hear that when you're a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really have the option of whether you're going to choose to believe it or not.
Exactly.
You got sponge brain. You believe it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then once it's set, like, it's so difficult, speaking from experience, and you can too, to stop thinking that way, even when you don't believe it.
Yeah. It's a trauma response.
Yeah. It's still difficult,
Yeah.
even when you can look at something and say, I absolutely don't believe that thing. But it's still ingrained because it was set from, in my case, 30-something years ago. It's like, well, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, and that fear can be triggered really at any time. Like, for me, that would be something that would just kind of feel like it was coming out of nowhere. And I you have all the physical symptoms of your heart's racing and that pit in the stomach. And then, it's like, then I have to say, okay, like, I know what this is. And just kind of have to accept that that's going to happen until it doesn't, hopefully someday. The thing that was really difficult and very insidious as far as the message goes was that all of this was necessary because God loves us. Try to reconcile that. I remember Mr. Armstrong. Ooh, I hate it when I say Mr. Armstrong. That's how we were taught to refer to him.
Herbie from now on.
Herbie. Oh gosh, I know somebody who would always say Mr. Herbert Armstrong. But I remember he would say, just as a father would punish and spank his child because he loves him and he's trying to teach him, so will God spank us. Like, he used those terms.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So, and would spank us into submission. That was said often. And I think, it's easier, like, if you look at it through that lens, to go back and interpret the way that Dad raised us and the things that he did and decisions he made and punishments he made, just like your isolation for 40 days and 40 nights. That was so cruel and inhumane and just really brutal and damaging. But why wouldn't it be? If the husband and the father is basically a model, physical model of a spiritual family, and our Heavenly Father has to punish us with these really cruel methods to get our attention, to get our submission, then why wouldn't the fathers also, the physical fathers, also be brutal in the way that they disciplined their children.
Yeah, the way it was put to us was that the way that the family was meant to be set up was a physical shadow of a spiritual reality, was the term.
Yes.
So that was the stage that was set. Like, you're supposed to operate this family the way that God would operate his family. And the way we were taught God operated his family was what you're describing.
Yes, and that was love.
Yes.
Because we're receiving both messages. We're receiving the message that God is love and God loves you and he's your loving heavenly Father. And then, but also when you aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing, like you're going to be dragged through the streets with fishhooks possibly, or tortured in the worst way possible. It's hard to reconcile those two things, but then you have this really warped and strange sense of what love is from the time that you're really little, because that's these two competing things are told to you and you just accept them. And, we were taught that unless earthly punishment was severe, the end result would be eternal punishment. When Armstrong would speak about all of the atrocities that would happen in World War III, essentially the Great Tribulation, it was God would have to be so harsh. And then also connected to that was his wrath, that he's angry. So he's acting out in anger against us, apparently, here. But because he had to be so harsh with his punishment so that we would have a broken spirit and contrite spirit, and we would turn to him, because if we didn't, because his punishment wasn't severe enough, then we would be banished from him, and that was the eternal punishment. And so it was taught to us that it was necessary for God to do this, because he loved us so much. He wanted us to be part of his family, and he wanted to turn us into spirit beings to rule the earth with him and Jesus Christ. And if it took all of, the things that happen in a world war to get us there, well, then that's what had to happen. And so that was very clear justification, I feel like, for abuse as far as fathers in families in the church went. I don't see any example of, that was taught to us of any type of grace or mercy, really. I know those things were mentioned, but it was just so heavy on punishment, at least from my perspective from growing up.
I think the way that Worldwide taught how the family was to be structured and operated even made fathers who otherwise wouldn't be, who weren't predisposed to do some of these things, act in this way. And then when you had those select few, that percentage of people in the church that they were predisposed to this, it made for particularly bad circumstances.
Really bad.
So, that obviously that's not like rocket science to kind of look at that and be like, yeah, I can see they had the reinforcement where even people who didn't really want to do that were acting in that way. And then you had the people that were like, yes, I absolutely agree with this. So it just made for not good stuff happening.
Right. They were just being handed power.
Yes. Yeah.
Along with the savage nature of all this imagery was also the fixation on nuclear war. And I think because Herbert Armstrong led with fear tactics, the fallout of nuclear war and like a nuclear winter was like described to us in fine detail. I don't know if you had to watch this film, but there was a film that came out in 1983 called The Day After. And it depicts a just very gruesome nuclear holocaust. And I remember watching this as a young child. Like, Dad had us watch this. It was supposed to be a really super realistic depiction of what would happen in the event that a nuclear bomb was dropped. And so it showed all of the things that happened after, like during the explosion and then the aftermath of that. And I remember Dad specifically, actually remember Dad talking about this more than I remember hearing it at church, probably because I was so small. But I remember Dad talking about, the hair loss, like people who are exposed to the radiation and their hair's just falling out in patches, and people who are too close get blinded by it, loss of hearing, like internal bleeding and lung damage and trouble breathing, and all of this from this nuclear winter. I can still remember some of the images from that movie and can remember how acutely fearful I was watching that. I was profoundly affected by that. And these were, mental images that I carried with me at all times. And, because we were God's elect, we were the only ones who knew God's truth, and we were the only ones who God would consider sparing from the atrocities of the Great Tribulation, which would include nuclear war. Sparing us from the Great Tribulation involved taking us to a place of safety, as you were taught also. The place of safety was not a place that we knew anything about. We did not know where it was. That would be revealed to Herbert Armstrong when the time came. And we were told that when it was time to flee, that we would somehow be told. We weren't even sure how we were going to find out. Like, there were rumors, is God gonna just speak to everybody? Or suddenly everybody's hearing the voice of God and we know where to go? Or is God gonna do this through network of the ministry? Do you remember?
Yes,
what?
And I was going to say, I was talking to a coworker about this earlier this week, I think. We did not believe in the rapture as a lot of mainstream Christianity views it, especially the Left Behind series and things. That not at all. It wasn't going to be as if it were we just disappeared and our clothes are left behind and planes without pilot. That whole thing, not at all. We were physically going to go to a place of safety that we would be told at the time, and we didn't know where that was or anything.
Right. So Dad held on to that from Armstrong then?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Where we were going was a mystery, although it was posited that it would be in Petra in Jordan, which is basically a city that was built into the mountainside, and it, I think, is between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, and it's protected by mountains. And so the picture was painted that we were going to be stowed away basically in these, I remember visualizing these little rock pods or something, these little cutouts in the mountain, and we're just going to be laying on rock with none of the normal amenities that we're used to,
I'm saved. Get my rock pod.
Right. But, that's preferable to being dragged through the street with a fish hook.
True.
So, but I still remember, as a child, that was scary. That was still scary. So it's, on one hand, it's okay, well, the Great Tribulation is really terrifying, but also Like, it's scary that all of a sudden we're going to have to just pick up and leave. I mean, they told us we wouldn't have time to go back in our house to get anything when it was time to flee. We were just going to have to, wherever we were, drop everything and go. And it's kind of scary to think that the ministry held that power, because they could have said that at any time to us and everyone would have just done it. And we were told, that it was going to be a really difficult 3.5 years at the place of safety. That's why you didn't want to have small children at the place of safety, because it was not going to be easy. And so either way, whether you're enduring the atrocities of World War III or you're sleeping in the desert on a rock, it's going to be a rough time for you. So in my little child mind, all this was coming up anytime. I remember spending so much time and mental energy on this, worrying about this. And as Dad gets, when he's like really fixated or obsessed with something, he will talk about it nonstop. You cannot escape it. And there's a complete lack of awareness of how much other people want to hear about it, because it's also not a two-way conversation. You can laugh. You can laugh.
Oh man, you're just like hitting that nail on the head. I don't want to talk about this, Dad. I'm saying in my mind.
Yeah, and if you had said it out loud, it's like, well, we're going to talk about it for 10 times longer than we were going to.
That's all we're going to talk about.
That's it. Yeah. He talked about it so much, and I think that I was very little when this happened. I mean, I had to have been 6 or under. And Dad got a tape recorder and he recorded me telling him my plan for how we were going to escape the armies that were coming for us during the Great Tribulation. And that tape was played over and over throughout my childhood as this cute thing. And as an adult and being out of this now, I look back on that and I just think that's what I thought about all the time. I was so afraid. My little brain was trying to figure out a way out of it. And being a very small child, my plan made no sense. My plan was that we would dig up the street and we would hide under it so that they wouldn't find us in our homes, because, there was the visualization of like dragging people out of their homes. And so I couldn't think of any other place to hide that they wouldn't find us. And I just remember like Dad just over the years just thinking that was just so cute that I came up with this story. And it's kind of astounding to me now, because I just think no child should ever have to be contemplating something like that. From as long as I can remember, all the way into my 30s, I prayed that I would be counted worthy to escape. That was the terminology. I don't know if that's how it was. Yeah. That, please let me be accounted worthy to escape the Great Tribulation. And sounds similar to what you said Blake would say. And I would very fervently pray that. I would beg. I feel like that language, like, please let me be worthy. Like, I'm doing everything I can to be good, but God's got to decide if it's enough, and I feel like this language is so illustrative of the culture that was in the church. We were taught that we were supposed to be praying that we would be counted worthy. So the idea that we were not inherently worthy of love or inherently worthy of protection from our Heavenly Father, What a concept. It was something that we had to earn. And the consequences of not working hard enough to earn that were catastrophic. And this ideology was passed down to the men in the church as what they should be modeling. And so God would be judging them for how they led their families. And that ties back into Dad and, the way that he raised us, with that always in mind, that he was modeling behavior that was supposed to be consistent with the way that God would parent. And it was definitely a conditional love kind of thing. You did not come into this world inherently worthy of love. There are things that you have to do, and you have to do them well, and you have to understand them perfectly, because you could be doing your best and thinking that you're doing okay, but you're not. And you're going to have to be severely punished, and somehow in the middle of being raped and tortured, you're going to realize like how you were wrong, and then you'll submit to God. Those were the messages. And I had a really hard time, even as a child, and I really especially remember this, my teenage years for some reason, I just had a really hard time reconciling that a loving God could do that to innocent people. And I would always think of our grandparents, granddad and grandma, and they were genuinely two of the kindest, most wonderful people I had ever known and probably ever will know. And they were Baptist. And therefore, they were going to have to go through the Great Tribulation. I could not wrap my head around that. Like, how could God do that? Like, he sees them. He loves us. They love us so well. And they do everything they can to be good people. And I see their goodness. And I just could not understand how they could be part of the tribulation. They could be, have this punishment exacted on them. And I feel like there was like this weird dichotomy in that, kind of like we just talked about, like on the one hand, only those who knew God and obeyed him would be spared. And not only that, they would eventually be full-fledged sons of God, leading and ruling the earth with Jesus. But then on the other side of the coin, only God calls people to the faith. So people who don't know can't help it, right? Because it's not even up to them. They could be exposed to the truth, in quotes, and still not get it because God hasn't opened their eyes. So why are they being punished? These were not answers that were given. Just because. This whole idea of people needing to be called by God was the reason why the Worldwide Church of God never had a church sign out. And they generally did not own church buildings. We rented. And part of that was because the end was coming. So why have equity or anything like that? But also, they didn't allow people to just walk in. And I think Dad definitely allowed people to come, right?
Yes.
Like there wasn't like a vetting process.
No, not at all. Like what I think we've described it some with Worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Like you weren't just going to visit. Like there would be times where you would be met at the door.
Absolutely. like who are you and why are you here?
Exactly. And here's the stack of literature that you need to read so that you understand what you're stepping into before you just come in the door.
Right. And also you're told after months, weeks or months, whatever, of counseling when you can actually come to services. Like a minister makes that call.
That policy was not something that made its way into our church crusade afterwards. We had a relatively within reason open door policy, but and I don't think this is a crusade church thing only. And I do think we've talked about this already a little bit, so I apologize if I'm being repetitive. But we had the saying that you could be any kind of member you wanted to be. So there were those people that were fully in, and then you had the people that were almost long-term visitors is almost the way it felt.
Yeah.
But again, you could only keep that up for so long because the pressure would be applied. It'd almost be like, okay, you're coming every weekend. Like, what's the deal? Like, why don't you go ahead and come all the way into the fold?
Right.
So that kind of atmosphere was set, but we did have, like, you could just come and visit. We had random people, just come off the street to come visit, and they weren't, stopped, apart from maybe a handful here and there through the years for, reasons that make sense. I guess if it's somebody that like, oh, this is a troubled person that's making a scene or whatever, like that stuff happens,
Yeah. Wow. So part of this dichotomy of, only the people who knew God and obeyed him would be spared, but then only God calls people and only the people called can be spared or even have the opportunity to be spared. I feel like that is just another tactic used to manipulate people when you're told that most people won't and simply cannot understand unless God chooses to open their eyes and call them. Then it teaches you to learn to dismiss anyone who calls you out on your beliefs, because the automatic fallback is that, of course, they don't understand because they don't know God. Like, you're never, ever going to be challenged. Your own belief system you will never allow that to be challenged. And, I think this is also in one of our intros where, Armstrong would say repeatedly that the carnal mind is enmity against God. And so we expected people to act with hostility.
Yeah. And he said, like, you
our
can't
beliefs.
Understand it.
Yeah.
Your carnal mind, you can't.
Yeah, exactly. So, I would, knowing that, believing that, I prayed so often, probably every prayer, that God would call granddad and grandma. Because I would just appeal to him, like, they are good people. Like, here are the things that they did. Or, they don't understand what's coming. Like, they don't understand. And please, at least, like, let them pass or call them before this happens. Because the idea of us escaping this, which we were hoping that we would be able to, and then knowing that all the people that we love back home and our friends and, people from school or whatever, they would all be suffering just unimaginable things, that was very heavy for me. So my childhood, I feel like, was just completely permeated with fear. And because this started so young, it was just built into my core. And I truly do not remember a time that I didn't think about the Great Tribulation every day. In a large part, I feel like, of my mental energy was expended towards thoughts of how to be worthy, to escape that. So you have that overarching theme. That was one of the two that I mentioned early on. The second overarching theme for me was demons, which I know we've mentioned. Demonic activity was talked about ad nauseum, especially by Dad. And I don't really understand what his obsession was with this, but I think you can probably attest to that. He always seemed to be fixated on demons. He talked about demons a lot.
Yeah, by name, specific.
Well, okay,
Demons.
well, he started that after
did he?
I
Okay.
left. Thank goodness. I think that would have made my fear like triple if I knew like George
If
the
you-
demon is in the next room, maybe.
Groot the demon is
Oh my
coming for
God.
you.
Okay.
God.
That
Have we
is
mentioned
that is a spoiler
Yeah,
alert for
I'm
a future
sorry.
episode, but there will be a demon introduced named Groot. That's
Or at
right.
least that looks
Groot.
like Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy Marvel TM.
I think, okay, Sarah and Jennifer told me about that when we first made contact again. And they said that the look on my face was priceless. I think my jaw dropped to the floor. I was like, what? Like Guardians of the Galaxy?
That's right.
But also, that doesn't seem that scary.
But it was very large.
Oh,
Tree height. So that's kind of scary.
Oh, that is scary.
Anyway, yeah, that is a spoiler. We're not gonna
Everyone
get
just
into
got a
that
little
yet.
treat.
Yeah. But we had specific later on, post Ashley, we
Yeah.
had specific demon names.
Demons that were assigned to your congregation.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which we were told that in Worldwide Church of God, you know, that there were demons that would target specific congregations and ranks of people, but never had any names. But it was just demonic activity was just talked about so frequently. I remember that we were going to move into a rental house and Dad went to look at it, and it would have been a great house for us, I think, size-wise and amenities and all of that. But Dad sensed the presence of demons, and he had the local elder come over. And I think I was around like 10th grade when this happened. But the local deacon actually went over with him and stood in the foyer. And I went, and yep, there's demons here. I can't even say that like with a straight face.
He felt a draft. Yes.
It was an old house, so
There are the demons.
yeah. Oh, and then there was I remember there was a man in the Russellville congregation. I remember his name. I will not say it, but he saw eyeballs on his wall apparently. And I remember Dad talking about that. And I'm a child. And that vivid imagery was so scary for me. And he would see eyeballs on the wall apparently when he would go to bed at night. Like, so
I remember when we were children, and this is having to do with the house that we lived in for most of my life. That before we moved there, that there were people practicing witchcraft in the house.
Yes.
In those upper rooms and like the attic.
Yes.
Which I had to live and stay
Oh.
in that room. So imagine like even that. It's like, yeah.
So you weren't really alone for the 40 days and 40 nights.
Well,
Probably
no,
like Groot was up there too.
Okay. So the 40 days and 40 nights, I was actually in your old room. By then.
Oh, okay.
I had moved. But you know the room in the front that has the 6 foot tall ceiling?
Yes.
That one. I stayed in that room, which has an attic connected to it, which we grew up being told that there was like witchcraft stuff in there and pentagrams. And there were, I guess, vagrants that were coming in the house that were doing witchcraft while it was vacant or something. That's how I remember it being told. So even then, it's like, that's why there were demons in the house before we moved. Which there were in that house, apparently, which I wondered when you were telling the story about when you were in 10th grade, like what happened between that house and this one, because the story, I guess Dad's point of view changed because it seemed like he rejected that house because there was demonic activity.
But I think the house that we ended up moving in is that house that you're describing. So I don't know.
The witchcraft house?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
I don't know.
How did we end up in that house where, that was, I think, where Dad was going over and like anointing and blessing the walls of the house and all that.
I
like,
remember that.
Like when did the shift occur? I don't want to get us completely off track, but when did the shift occur to where it was like, well, we're not going to live in this house because there's a
more
demon.
Dangerous demon.
More
demons.
Maybe it is. I don't know. But anyway, something shifted there. Maybe we can get into that in a future episode in the psychology of that. But
yeah,
there's something there.
Wow. And I just the term demon problems was used so frequently. Hey, he has a demon problem. Why are we laughing?
May I ask in what context that was used? If somebody had car trouble, I was like, John's got demon problems again. What was the context?
That's basically the context. Okay. No, I mean, and we laugh because it's so absurd, but at the same time, if someone actually had a mental illness or if someone had depression, would be viewed as a demon problem. So it was really anathema in the church to seek out a psychologist, a mental health counselor. Even that field was not acceptable to even go into for someone. And so if someone had any type of real problem that could be helped by mental health care professional, they would not get that help. And instead, they would speak to the ministry who would say, well, demons are probably bothering you, and then they would treat it that way.
Or as in my case, he knows what to do. Act as if.
Act as if
like
you're
that
not depressed.
kind of mentality is like, no, you don't need any help from anybody who's trained for this. Like,
no.
We've got the answers for these things. And if it's one we can't understand, it's demons. You know what I mean? I'm not to make light of it because that is true.
But it's so ignorant. Think about how ignorant that is. We have so much information at our fingertips now. And they were, and I guess still are to a degree, still treating mental illness like they did thousands of years ago when we had very limited knowledge and thought all kinds of things were caused by spirits, or when people thought the sun was a god. Well, now we know what causes a lot of different maladies. And why are they still treating mental health issues like they did 2,000 years ago? I just feel like it's inexcusable. They performed exorcisms. I think that was rare. So if someone had a demon problem in the church, it didn't mean that they were possessed by a demon. It meant that a demon was messing with them, would not leave them alone. I remember hearing about people who were being physically attacked by demons. So you might have something like someone is saying they're being dragged around by their hair through their house. Like I literally had someone tell me that in the church. That was actually in the Living Church of God. And then you just had other things like, you hear a noise in the attic, or I remember specifically with Dad, there was like tinkering noises or something coming from under the sink in the kitchen. And he said those were demons. Because when he would go in there, it would stop. So all kinds of things were attributed to demons. And I remember the terminology being, Satan and his demons. So they were lumped together, and it was, that Satan is, roams about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And his demons were, they're with him, and they were also doing his bidding. And they were particularly attracted to God's elect, to us, because, we were going to get this great honor of being part of God's family. And because Satan and his demons hated God and hated the idea of us becoming part of God's family, it was like their mission to destroy us if they were able to. And that would be like a huge win against God. Like, we got one of God's elects. And I remember being told that you specifically, like, you are one of God's chosen, and it would be like a trophy, for a demon to pull you from God. In our minds, and even me as a small child, like, I'm in a battle of epic proportions. Where I truly believe that Satan and his demons are constantly trying to cause me and the people around me to stumble and fall away from God. And, falling away from God meant eternal punishment, as we mentioned before. And I think we also brought this up in the 4th episode about the bite model. But Stephen Hassan, in his book, Combating Cult Mind Control, he talks about that. I believe that's where that is, where, in cults, they sometimes bond together because there is a common enemy. There's, like, I think Dr. Hassan said something to the effect of, there's always, a devil lurking around the corner, and that devil could be take the form of, name whatever. But for us, like, actually was the real devil and his demons that were lurking around the corner. So, in that scenario, the group bands together in a trauma bonded sort of way to rally against the enemy, and everyone was worried about demons. At least everyone had a concern about demons. It was just part of being in the worldwide Church of God.
I had the mental image growing up and into my adulthood of, looking at your surroundings wherever you were and thinking like, oh, there are unseen
Yes.
demons all around, but also a hedge of unseen angels around me in particular. Because
you hope
yes,
you've done well enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming, depending on what day, that I'm God's elect, as I've said before, God's special boy, maybe. And other days, maybe not. But yeah, that mental image of like all around, all the time.
Yes, me too. I had that too. Although I would say, rather than a hedge, it was more like a guardian angel. Like, in my mind growing up, supposedly there was a guardian angel. But if I really think about my own experience, I don't know how much I believed that, because if I truly believed that, then I don't know that I would be as terrified as I was of a demon like coming to get me, which was really a like dominant thing throughout my childhood, like my entire childhood. We were, told that there was constant threat and that we were to be on guard. And I feel like that was a prevailing thing, that we were always on guard, which is really just a state of hypervigilance. And I think that hypervigilance, just combined with, the church's teachings that we're talking about here and scary things, but combine that with the way that we were raised in narcissistic abuse, that hypervigilance just became my baseline, which I think it did for all of us. But just speaking for myself, I think it became my baseline, and I had nothing to compare it to. And I had literally no idea the toll that it was taking on me. And like looking back now, the thought of that is just absolutely exhausting, to just constantly feel like you have to be on guard, just always watching. You can't rest. So even exorcisms were performed in the church, although not often. And I would really be curious to know how many of those, or, just people who were having mental health issues. I know of one specific instance that is just kind of horrifying to think about now. There was someone I was really close to, and her son, unbeknownst to everyone, had Asperger's. And he was probably under the age of 10, and he was having some auditory and visual hallucinations, I believe. His mother was obviously concerned and trying to find answers. And the local minister determined that this was demonic activity, that he actually was, I guess, possessed by a demon, because he found it fit to perform an exorcism on this child. He came to their house, and oh gosh, I wish I remembered all of these details. It's been so many years, but I remember that there was, cloths with oil that had been anointed ahead of time, and whatever he did there lasted quite a while. And I know he was laying hands on this child, trying to rebuke the demon and get the demon to come out. And according to my friend, it was extremely frightening for her and for her son. She ended up intervening and stopping the exorcism somewhere in the middle of it, because she just couldn't take what it was doing to her son. And then, she was able to seek out appropriate help, and then he was diagnosed. And, as far as the hallucinations go, they went away when he was on the right medication. There's that instance. And then I have, a firsthand experience with a young person who was like 21, I think. He had a pretty severe depression, and he attempted suicide and failed. And during this time that he had depression, he, didn't see a mental health provider. Instead, it was counseling with the ministry. They're not qualified or educated on anything having to do with mental health. And it was determined that a demon was bothering him. And even after he had his failed suicide attempt, which left him terribly disfigured and blind, even after that, they still had him counseling with the ministry. That was the church, like that was the stance, because he had demon problems. A demon was bothering him. And, he eventually did actually, he was successful and ended his life. And I remember thinking even then, and this was actually not in Worldwide. This was when I was in the Living Church of God, one of the offshoots of Worldwide. and I was already, in my 20s, I remember just thinking how irresponsible it was. And even with all of the church's teachings about psychology and like, going back to the demons, if it was seeing a psychologist was basically a portal to demons, as we were told. You were opening up your mind. Interestingly enough, and ironically enough, they said you're opening up your mind to mind control, the very thing they were doing. So, I witnessed this fixation with demons and their effects, the effect of that firsthand. And, as I've just said, like that was, sometimes devastating consequences for labeling a mental illness or a mental state, as a demon problem. And so then you're not getting the help that you need. So one of the big pieces of advice that the church taught and gave was that, that we were, if you didn't want a demon bothering you, then you don't think about demons. You do not open the door to demons to come in and influence you or possess you at the worst. And so, opening the door to demons could come in the form of, watching movies like The Exorcist or Amityville Horrors or, other such movies, or reading material that would have the occult involved, or even like a Ouija board. I'm like, oh my goodness, like you don't go near a Ouija board. Like,
you avoid that aisle at Target.
That's right.
I still feel that way.
Oh no.
Not actually.
Let's get a Ouija board and have an episode.
Yeah, but there's something about that was so ingrained where it's like, yeah, I don't believe that stuff, but I'm not getting that Ouija board. Right. No way.
I'm getting you one for your birthday.
Thank you.
No, I've still not touched one myself because that is like really ingrained. I don't think that I'm scared of it. It's just I went so long in my life avoiding anything like that. Like, I've not watched The Exorcist. I would never, like growing up and, up until, like my mid-30s, would definitely not ever watch a movie that involved any type of possession, or I didn't like horror movies at all. If there was a spiritual element to it, count me out, because I would be absolutely convinced that I would be visited by a demon. So, and I know Dad taught that, there's a sermon he gave about opening portals to demons, which that is included in some of our intro to the podcast, and hearing some of his ideas of what portals are is really interesting, to say the least. Worldwide, I feel like was, how do I say this? Pretty straightforward. Like, don't do the Ouija board. Don't watch the scary movies. Don't dwell on demons. That was a big thing. But for Dad, and from what you've said, it sounds like if you get a tattoo, you're opening the door to a demon.
Smoke weed, demon. Believe it or not, demon.
Yeah. Well, now I will say any type of substance abuse was opening the door, because your mind is like more pliable and like susceptible to that. So we were taught that in Worldwide.
Yoga, demon.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I will say, like, looking at you right now with all of your tattoos, like the demons are coming.
Oh yeah. Covered up with demons, not tattoos. Well, both.
Oh, and he said not obeying your parents was opening a portal to demons, a rebellious spirit, which I think also is used with the tattoos.
That sounds right.
Like the only reason you get a tattoo is because you have a rebellious spirit, and
Yes.
that rebellious spirit comes from Satan.
Yeah, it's counterculture, which it's not now, but these counter-cultural things.
Yeah.
It's rebellion, demons.
Oh, yeah. So, as a child, the constant threat of demons was a massive part of my childhood. Like, I cannot even tell you how many times I went to sleep at night curled up in a ball with the covers over my head. I'm talking about into my teen years, where I am in a state of just being petrified. You know, when you're told not to think about this thing, right? Because if you think about it, like, you're inviting it in. And so try not thinking about something. And, it's not that demons definitely came to my mind throughout the day. But it was easy to distract myself in the light of day and in the activity of the day. And it was much more difficult at night when it's bedtime and it's dark and I'm alone in my bed. And I would just have these moments where I think I just got worked up with the fear of it so much that it would result in just almost like a paralyzed state. I vividly recall times where I fell asleep praying, and it wasn't like a normal prayer. It was almost like a mantra, where I would just be like, I would just be praying to God, like, please protect me, and keep demons far from me. Like, that was the thing that I would say. Set your guardian angels around about me and keep me safe from harm, and keep demons far from me. That was like something I just said on repeat. I don't know how many times. I feel like this was something that was part of my daily life. To think about it, I didn't always fall asleep in that terrified state, but that was common for me. And I've thought about this recently. I don't think I ever once got out of bed and went downstairs to tell mom and dad. I don't think I ever did that. I don't, and I was trying to think, why would I not do that? And I think the answer is that I was scared that I was even thinking about it. So I didn't want to give it any more life. Oh gosh, like, I would pray, I would try to sing songs in my head. But I just had this really intense fear of my mind being quiet, because I thought that would be an opening. At least it would be the opening to me contemplating their existence and their possibility of them being in my room. And I was just so afraid of them, quote unquote, bothering me. And, it was the other piece of that is not wanting to be in the dark. I never wanted to be in the dark because I associated demons with darkness. So that was a fear that I had, which is interesting when you consider Dad's message to me that, in darkness, unable to move, you'll find great surprise and fear. Well, I kind of was already experiencing that throughout my childhood in my paralyzed state of terror. And, I don't know if I ever talked about that to anyone. Not until I was completely out of all of it. Even as, a married woman and being in my 20s into my 30s, I still thought about demons. And I still would immediately do those stop thinking techniques, to no, I'm not going to think about that.
If you like this episode of The Cult Next Door, please leave us a positive review and rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to subscribe to be notified of new episodes.